Hi, I'm Jhalak,
Hi, I'm Shashank.
and welcome to the CCG Tech Podcast.
On today's episode, we speak to Apar Gupta about net neutrality and internet shutdowns in India. Recently, the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India released a consultation paper on regulatory mechanisms for OTT communication services and the selective banning of OTT apps. Background to this consultation is a long-standing demand by telecom service operators from not just India but around the world about getting paid what is known as network fees from internet services for using their infrastructure. In 2016, the TRAI took a definitive stance to institutionalize robust net neutrality principles in India's telecom regulations. On public consultations before that, CCG had provided technical submissions to the TRAI on the importance of incorporating the principles of freedom of expression and net neutrality in India's telecom laws, which the authority then relied upon. At CCG, we continue to track policy conversations on net neutrality in India and support the importance of recognizing principles of net neutrality in telecom regulation.
Okay, thanks, Apar. Thanks so much for again being here. I'd like to start by asking you to introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Apar Gupta. I'm a lawyer and I'm a public policy professional based in New Delhi, India. Thank you so much for having me here.
Thanks, Apar. Thanks so much for taking out the time.
Apar, a few months back, the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India came out with this consultation paper, which had, various components to it. One of the things that really is very important to discuss and have people thinking about within the Indian context is what the proposals seek to do to the principle of net neutrality. Could you walk our listeners through what is net neutrality and why is it important for the health of the internet?
Thanks so much, Jhalak, for having me here. I think net neutrality is a vital conversation for more people today in India. India has close to about 850 million to 860 million internet connections, if not users. And net neutrality as a principle ensures that they can access the internet with a sense of fairness, that it's to a large extent free and open, in which your internet service provider, which means your telecom company like Reliance Jio, Airtel, or Idea, is not bringing in different technical ways to impede or to limit your ability to visit a website by slowing it up or making it faster. For instance, if you shop on Flipkart versus Amazon and one loads faster than the other, it's because Flipkart and Amazon have coded it in a way, or they have CDN sitting next to that network, rather than your telecom operator deciding that, hey, I like Amazon more than I like Flipkart, or I like Flipkart more than Amazon. That choice is yours, right? And it's that choice, that user autonomy, which is at the basis and at the root of net neutrality. And it has a lot of knock-on effects and benefits. For instance, ensuring very low entry barriers for internet-based businesses, independent publishers, independent news websites, in which they don't need to negotiate with the telecom operator. So it's a multi-sided beneficial regulatory intervention to ensuring that telecoms, which provide you data access, are a level playing field for the people who are there and providing you the access to information and knowledge which you want without your choice being interfered by ISP.
Thanks, Apar, for throwing light on why net neutrality is important for us. I'd like to dive into the one of the main questions that the consultation seeks to answer. And coming to that, the argument is that telecom operators argue that they're heavily regulated, they run high costs, they pay spectrum fees, abide by onerous license requirements, invest heavily in maintaining network infrastructure that all of us use, and all of this comes at a cost. And they say that this is not true for internet services. They don't have to sort of pay license fees, they don't have to subscribe to onerous regulation, and hence telecom operators want internet services to compensate them for using this infrastructure, right? They say that they're piggybacking off the infrastructure that we maintain with so much cost. But I want to get your perspective on this. Is this a new demand or is this a legacy issue? Can you break down this argument for us a bit?
So thanks so much for asking this, Shashank. Actually, this has been the primary demand, this is the primary reason why the Telecom Regulatory Authority is not only put out a consultation paper on OTT services this year, but in fact, if you look back and you go back to the launch of the Save the Internet campaign, which was on 13th of April 2015, that was also the same justification we saw, in which telecom operators were saying, oh, poor old rich me. I don't get to make money. And look at these internet businesses, these large companies like Facebook, Google, which are valued in the billions. Now, this kind of framing is very self-serving because the internet is not Google and Facebook as much as large Silicon Valley platforms do constitute a bulk of the traffic. In fact, we have to look at the much more smaller details which are here of the reasoning by the ISPs. The first reason is that there's no regulatory regime. There are no rules of the road for internet businesses. This is completely false. Ask any person in tech policy, and more recently, they're not. And I think everyone knows one lawyer who works on some issue of tech these days. Okay, that by itself shows that there is some form of regulation or there is some form of regulatory oversight, whether it may be a content, carriage, etc. Even if you discount all of that, after all, the telecom businesses are providing infrastructure, hence there are specific type of regulatory requirements to ensure that your towers are set up in a proper way, right? Quality of service is there. For instance, your calls do not drop. So those are very specific regulatory requirements which are there. And the same way they exist for internet platforms and services. It's not perfect. More are needed, but it's not like there's a vacuum. Okay, that's the first thing. So a lot of demands which are made for national security or content-based offenses, well, the Indian Penal Code does apply to them. Let's make it very clear. And there's an intermediary liability framework also. It's very bad, but it's there. So there's no vacuum. The second thing is essentially the articulation of grievance and victimization by saying that, hey, by the way, we are suffering massive losses. But here the telecom operators speak in two different voices. Okay, and we noticed this way back in 2015, Shashank, way back when they were saying that, oh, our revenues and profit is being cannibalized because people are switching from SMS-based text to internet-based messaging. Everyone is starting to use WhatsApp, and we make a lot of money through SMS. So the actual substantive examination of this did not hold up because at the same time, you had people like Gopal Vittal, who was leading Airtel, saying that there is no threat of cannibalization. And these are like actual statements on investor calls which they made. Now, you may say that, okay, companies are just trying to, comfort their investors, but they are being much more honest and candid in regulatory submissions to the TRAI. That's also not the case, because if you look at the earnings data, which is being projected at that time in 2015 by, let's say, Morgan Stanley, which made a report on Indian telecoms, it said that the loss in revenue from voice and SMS-based text will be more than compensated by growth in revenues in data. And has that been true? Actually, that has come about. If the TRAI consultation paper, which has been recently put out, and I'm quoting from it, states, as may be seen from the above table, and there's a table people should look at, the contribution of data usage in the revenue from mobile subscribers has grown to more than 10 times, from 8.10% in the quarter ending June 2013 to 85.1% in the quarter ending December 2022. So most of the money telecom operators today are making is because of data usage. And let's not forget, we are paying for it. And why are we paying for it? We are not paying for the telecom operators to provide us the content. We're paying the telecom operators to provide us the connectivity services. So let's say this entire conversation, which began close to 10 years ago and is still continuing, lacks a lot of basis either in analytical reasoning as to how regulation works or in an economic justification, which is also absent. And one can also look at the earning reports or the earnings before income tax, the EBITDA kind of things. And it's not like the Indian telecom industry is in a very perilous position. In fact, by looking towards the fair share, which they articulate as fair share of these kind of data-heavy applications which are used by them, it may actually end up being counterproductive towards them. Less people may use them because India is a price-sensitive market, and they may shift away from large platforms, or large platforms may become larger because large platforms are the ones which may then be the only ones which can be served at a certain speed, geographic ability. So you may only get to watch movies more and more on Netflix, which may deepen market concentration, rather than look at those much more independent documentaries on Mubi or those smaller platforms which may not have the money to pay a big telecom operator.
Right. And what confuses me, Apar, when I look at this conversation is won't more internet services create more business for telecom operators, as you're pointing to? And I'll just quickly come to a quote that resonates with me. This is a quote from Professor Shuvik. She says, it's not quite clear why one would want to punish the services that create the demand for the ISP's product. Imagine a beach resort being angry that pleasant weather, pretty sunsets, fine sand, and warm water make people rent their rooms. So absolutely resonates with me. Yeah.
I think to a large extent, it also has to do with the nature of businesses which have very large regulatory barriers for entry. And once people get those kind of licenses and there's market concentration, and your market is also growing, but it's growing at a much more predictable scale, you're looking towards other kinds of revenue streams. And it's quite often an acceptable business practices practice in not only historically large corporations, but also much more modern tech businesses to discover or to build multiple revenue streams. And quite often large businesses want to do that through what is called as regulatory moats, requiring through law for somebody to give them a piece of the pie. So I think they are wanting to do that over a period of time and coming up with new technical and economic justifications to do that, because it's an entrenched entity, right? It's a large entity which is there, right? And it is wanting to do that over a period of time again and again by making these demands.
But that's really interesting. And I think like 10 years back when you were part and, leading the Save the Internet campaign, that was a decision point for us as a country in terms of how we think about the internet and internet infrastructure, provision of internet services. I think today, again, we're at one such decision point, right? And we can head towards a dystopian internet future where net neutrality as a principle is no longer sort of central to the architecture of the internet, or we could head towards a utopian future when net neutrality continues to sort of be the backbone, one of the backbone principles of internet and internet infrastructure. Could you, for our listeners, map out what and contrast what this dystopian versus utopian future could look like? I think in what you've been explaining to our listeners over the last several minutes, you've sort of alluded to some of the challenges or positives of net neutrality, but if you could really, I think, articulate it, it will really bring home to all of us what this really means for us on a daily basis.
So, Jhalak, actually, net neutrality flows from the doctrine of natural resources as public goods, which is that the spectrum, the airwaves, which have the ability of transmitting information into our smartphones, is actually owned by all of us as citizens of India. One of the core understandings which flows from that, it needs to be used in a way which is fair then, or allocated in a way which is fair. Now, the much more tangible manifestation in the net neutrality consultations which came about first was with respect to differential pricing. Now, let me break this down what it meant. Let's go back into a rabbit hole. In 2015, Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg want to launch a free internet access based platform service called, I think so, internet.org and then Free Basics. initially the idea is that a lot of people don't have the money to pay a telecom operator to get internet. So you will onboard them by giving them a very low package GPRS version of the internet, which will just have Facebook and apps which will be selected by Facebook. So it'll be a bouquet of like 10 apps. It'll be like a package you will get, and that will help rural India come online for the first time onto the biggest platform, which is Facebook. Now, this was a point of what is called as a prohibition of discriminatory tariffs, because here your telecom operator would actually not be charging you. It would be giving you something free. But what happens when things are given free is that it distorts the market, and it distorts the market in favor of Facebook. And what this does when this program is actually prohibited in India is that it provides the ability not only for people to sign on to other social media networks, but also not confuse Facebook when they're accessing internet for the first time with the internet. The internet is much larger for people in India than Facebook. Now let's look at where internet.org and Free Basics has actually been used. It's been used in Myanmar. And what's the effect of that is actually reflected in the communal clashes which happened there, because there was Free Basics, etc. And they indicated that people had a cognitive dysfunction in which they presumed that whatever was put on Facebook was actually true. Facebook was the only need or primary means of networked information, digital network information, which is flowing through. And I remember I walked through when I visited DC this year through the Holocaust Museum, and there's a separate section on what happened in Myanmar, and there are specific slides with respect to the internet.org program. So, Jhalak, I'm glad you asked me that question. The internet would look very, very different today if internet.org or Free Basics would have been there. It would have deepened market concentration, which is also why when in the recent recent consultation paper, TRAI has again prompted that question. Not only digital rights groups, as well as research bodies such as CCG, who have worked historically on that issue, have cited concern, but also a large number of Indian startups have said that we will need to negotiate with telecom operators or pay them, and that will really make our cost of operation higher. It will divert the amount of capital which we raise, which is towards building product and user acquisition, towards negotiating with, can people access our app or our web service, which we are just building out. So it will have a huge impact, not only on online businesses, but the innovation, the services which are eventually offered to end users. It will not only impact, let's say, people in rural India, but will also encourage people in urban India possibly to have a second mobile phone which has Free Basics on it, and deepen market concentration where Facebook or any other company becomes a content-based gatekeeper. So I think it's really important that the principle of net neutrality receives continued regulatory protection.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen countries like South Korea that have sort of moved away from this formulation of net neutrality, and it's, had significant implications for the way various internet service providers are functioning, for the way you're able to access various services like Netflix versus other services. So I think it's really important for people to be thinking about this issue. And we're really grateful to you for breaking it down.
Thanks, Apar, for breaking that down. That's so helpful to give the historical context. And we will come back to you on the Save the Internet campaign closer to the end of this conversation. But I want to shift the conversation a bit to something different. This TRAI consultation, Apar, also seeks public opinion on selective banning of apps. Selective banning of apps as a measure for crisis response as compared to shutting down the internet as a whole. You have worked extensively on the subject of shutdowns, Apar, both before courts and in the domain of public policy, both in your personal capacity as well as your previous sort of gig at IFF. I wanted to get your opinion on this suggestion by TRAI, right? Very intuitively to someone, it might sound like a good option. Fine, we're infamous for shutting the internet down as a whole. Yes, Supreme Court's recognize that certain services are very important. Why don't we, keep, let's say, banking and financial services on, but let's say shut off some services like social media applications. Based on your experience and your work around shutdowns in India, apart generally, I would love to get your opinion on this suggestion.
It seems like such a seductive argument in which you can say that, you can selectively shut down the internet, and after all, it's going to help prevent the loss of life or damage to public property. Like, it makes so much sense for so many people because India holds the top rank for internet shutdowns. It comes at a large social economic cost, opportunity cost, and the way a lot of people are looking at it draws from an isolated recommendation emerging from the report of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Information Technology, which is part of multiple recommendations. So the first thing which you have to look at is the intent a little much more closely, because the recommendations include the need to study whether internet shutdowns, one of the primary recommendations, do internet shutdowns actually help prevent the loss of life or property damage, right? And there's no study. The DOT and the MHA kind of resisted, and now this year in the action taken report, there's a expression of exasperation by the standing committee. Why won't you conduct such a study if you're losing thousands of crores every year, right? If people are not having access to the internet for 3 days, not only in extreme instances of civil strife such as in Jammu and Kashmir or Manipur, and even I dispute like that's justifiable for internet shutdown, but even in places like Rajasthan or Haryana, why are you shutting down the internet? But there's no study, so we need to first see it in that perspective. The second is that limited internet shutdowns are already being done. Internet is shut down primarily on mobile internet, but not on wired fixed line internet. So medium-based discrimination is already there. Okay, but is it having the effect which it should have? What people possibly are trying to indicate is that let's be service specific, which means that firstly, in technical ways, you have to do deep packet inspection if you're trying to categorize websites, or you are having a list of websites which you're whitelisting. Now, quite often, this leads to a whole host of problems. For instance, it's not like people are only accessing 500 or 5,000 websites, right? It depends on everyone's individual use. Shashank, you're a researcher which deals with law, tech, and policy. It's not like you will only be referring to 5 databases. You may look at 10 research papers. You may go to Google Scholar and thereby get into much more deeply, going to different individual researchers, etc., places like that. We also draw a learning from social media, which is first sought to be banned. People who are practicing telemedicine, doctors, they may do the same thing. People are looking at trade and businesses, may be following very specific price indices, which they may be using. Okay, so it makes no sense at all. And then if you try to only make 500 or 1,000 or 5,000 or even 50,000 websites accessible, there's a large level of interplay which happens in websites in which they pull different elements on the same web page from 50, 60 different servers. Okay, so it's very, very, very tough to implement. Okay, now beyond that, on a very principle basis, I just like to ask, right, what are the websites which are sought to be banned? Okay, which you think are the ones which for some period of time should not be seen, right? And those kind of websites, actually, if you look at qualitative studies, ground-based reports, actually lead to civic organizing quite often, which leads to people voicing their demands to public authorities in peaceful ways, which means that they do not resort to violence. And it's been noted by Jan Rasdak in a study, empirical study, that it leads to less instances of violence, or it leads to corrective instances of accountability, which has been noted in a study around Manipur, which is called of sieges and shutdowns. And I've written about this quite a lot in the context of Manipur, because this is a really seductive idea, limited internet shutdowns. Let's have the ability of picking and choosing which websites will be available. And this is also forgetting that we, in any instance, have the regulatory under law, you have the power to block specific websites. Now, the problem is it doesn't have any transparent process, and it's quite often being done disproportionately. Entire accounts are blocked rather than one individual tweet or a social media post, or an entire website is taken down rather than a specific article. And even the reasons behind that censorship are not made public, and there's no opportunity for the fundamental right to receive information to be activated by, let's say, a regular citizen in terms of being filing a legal challenge, a writ petition to challenge that specific internet shutdown order. So to take away from this, the TRAI consultation on OTT services is not only on net neutrality. If you look at it, it's in two large buckets. The first is on net neutrality and OTTs and regulation around them. And the second is with respect to internet shutdowns, more so with the seductive idea, I'm saying seductive again, or because it is for limited internet shutdowns. And I've written about it both in the Indian Express and in the Hindu.
Yeah. And it's interesting, Apar, how the consultation paper itself mentions the Anuradha Bhasin judgment,
Yes.
which you have worked upon. And IFF and you have spoken about how there are instances where even those guidelines are not being followed, right? So, right, naturally, as a researcher, the first thought is let's follow guidelines that have been laid down, right? And so how do you, when you think about what is happening, how do you sort of merge all of this together?
My takeaway from a lot of this is that state governments across India want to prevent organizing, which is a fundamental right, which drive towards cause of public accountability, or they lack state capacity in performance of law and order through proper policing. And thereby they look towards shutting down the internet without realizing that it's become a really integral part of human existence. People can't function without the internet, just like they can't function to a large extent without electricity. I know it's an extraordinary claim, but for large sections of Indian society, sometimes their economic sustenance, if they're into gig work, or in terms of their personal relationships, that sphere of life, because quite often there's so much movement in India, it relies very heavily on the internet. There's a very deep, invasive nature of coercion which comes through this. So I would say that, we need to look at internet shutdowns from the constitutional principle of proportionality. Now, it's interesting you mentioned the Anuradha Bhasin judgment. The Anuradha Bhasin judgment was an outcome of several public interest petitions which were filed after the Article 370, which regarding to the special status of Jammu and Kashmir was revoked. At the same time, all telecommunication services were suspended in Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh. And subsequent to that, there was an incremental restoration with first phones being permitted, then different forms of censorship, and finally mobile internet was restored in some districts and then later in all of Kashmir. But there was a long period in which telecommunications were not available, more than 550 days. The judgment by itself laid down safeguards, because the principal point of contention in that judgment was that the orders behind the internet shutdowns were claimed to be impacting national security and thereby could not be made public. So the government was saying that you can shut down this internet secretly. And the court essentially in that judgment held that you need to give reasons when you shut down the internet. Internet shutdowns cannot be perpetual. You need to have review committees. These review committees itself also need to function with transparency. But it also did state that you can examine and do limited internet shutdown. So that was there in the judgment. However, it is important for people to know that lawyers who argued that case or the other petitions, which were in the batch of cases, did not question the constitutionality of internet shutdowns per se. They were only challenging the procedure and specific orders. So what that means, it's an open question. Because for a lot of constitutional scholars, as well as practitioners, internet shutdowns are per se disproportionate. The doctrine of proportionality is a legal doctrine which says that if you need to restrict somebody's fundamental freedoms, it needs to be done with the least amount of invasiveness possible to satisfy the state objective. And internet shutdowns per se violate that because they shut down for a few pieces of potentially harmful content, which may have potentially bad real-world consequences. And I'm saying this because there's no study establishing this link by the government of India. That it still bans the large section of society which uses the internet for the day-to-day needs, for the entertainment, cultural, economic, social, and personal use.
Thanks, Apar. And because I have you, I'll push you a bit more, and maybe if you can, give your sort of principal thought on this. Do you think then, as we have the right to free speech, the right to practice trade and business, do we need to think about making the right to access internet as a fundamental right? As you said, it's become such an essential public good as electricity. And I know courts have held that speech online is protected, your right to do business online is protected, but do we need to expand it to all access?
So, Shashank, the way the courts have done it is that they've bundled it with the associated fundamental freedoms under Article 19 and 21 and said that it is an extension of that. So, because you can't access the internet, you can't practice your trade and profession, you can't practice your free expression. What you're saying is that it should be possibly an independent right. And for people who are not familiar with constitutional law, courts have interpreted independent fundamental rights, such as the right to clean air and water, the right against, unlawful detention, and then issued guidelines are under that. I think that that'll be a good thing to do because it elevates it as an independent freestanding right and helps the development of a richer, much more substantive body of doctrine. But a lot of that depends on the enforcement because quite often we see doctrine does not result in practice or outcomes.
During the course of this conversation, Apar, we've talked about many key stakeholders in the policy-making process. We've talked about government that really comes up with a policy idea. We've talked about legislature that frames laws. We've talked about the role that government and regulators play in framing rules and regulations, enforcing these, regulatory principles. We've talked about the role of really the public through campaigns in driving certain policy change, and shaping the public discourse. You played a important role in the Save the Internet campaign, which was about a decade back around net neutrality, and really wanted to take the opportunity to talk to you a little bit about this experience. What does such a public campaign entail? What is the role that something like this can have in impacting the development of policy? And really, are there any lessons you think are handy from that previous sort of experience in today's context?
So the Save the Internet campaign actually emerged out of the TRAI consultation paper, but the large amount of the thought process was derivative from what John Oliver did in terms of channeling both pop culture and the ability for people to send in their comments to the American telecom regulator, the Federal Communications Commission, FCC. And I was tweeting about taking screenshots from the TRAI paper because it was, you can go back and look at it. They wanted to even regulate online gaming and stuff like that. And Nikhil Pava was also screenshotting and tweeting about it. We met the next day. A large part of that is cataloged. And the campaign was set. The campaign had three primary planks. One was towards civic literacy, came through the partnership and the collaboration of a lot of stand-up comics at that time who made videos to popularize this issue, explain the stakes to people in an entertaining and engaging format. It came through a digital platform which was set up by Kiran, a lot of other friends from HasGeek as well as the Bangalore tech community, and a lot of the law policy space also participated, was supportive, disagreed, refined. There were academics, broad sections of society. The economic analysis was done by, for instance, Deepak Shenoy from Capital Mind to some extent. There were so many collaborators. So I think the enduring lesson of the Save the Internet campaign is that for a lot of the work which is done on technology, there is a need to build broad coalitions, also involve the public more often in a very intrinsic way. I want to also be a little much more realistic about can such campaigns be built today? Because I'm asked that question quite often. And I would say that it's much, much, much more tougher to do that today than it was earlier. There was a sense of novelty. And also what helped us was that These net neutrality is one of those issues where a large section of the interests which lie to some extent are also emerging in complement with the Indian tech sector, the aspirations of technology startups. You don't usually see that around privacy, surveillance, free speech. And it's also not having a very high level of risk because it is taking a India first narrative against big tech platforms in a very nationalistic framing. There's some academic writing around this as well. Why did the net neutrality campaign succeed? There's some academic critique. I think Smarika Kumar has done a brilliant paper on this, in which she questions that whether it deepened the larger conception of the democratic commons. It's like this, you can think about it from those perspectives, but for the time and the space, with the amount of foresight which was there at that time, I think people were well intentioned, and we did the best we could have done at that time. One thing which is disappointing and has been disappointing about the net neutrality campaign, and I think is a lesson which I took to my life, is that the campaign also needed work to be continued. Campaigns and movements which are built online are built on the energy, enthusiasm, narrative points in which things happen every day or every week. So there's a sense of excitement, but that excitement dies, right? Like people are not able to sustain it. But the social problem which you're trying to address is a little much more long-term, like net neutrality. It's still come up after 10 years, right? So it needs organizations, it needs research bodies, it needs institutional capacity, which can reignite that level of public curiosity, mapping that movement all through that period of time, especially when they're entrenched interests such as a telecom sector, which is always looking to double dip and grow its revenues. So, I think I look forward to younger people setting up better campaigns with the benefit of hindsight.
Hopefully, listening to this podcast will enthuse folks within the Indian context to come forward and push the envelope on many of these issues. Thanks so much for joining us today, Apar. It's been such a pleasure hearing from you on not only the issue of net neutrality, but broader sort of commentary from you on social change and the role of campaigns within the policy domain. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here, Jhalak, Shashank.
Thanks, Apar. Again, it's been great.
We would love to hear your thoughts on the episode and your suggestions on what topics you would like us to cover. You can reach out to us through email or find us on our social media. We will link the details of these in the show notes. Lastly, we would like to thank National Law University Delhi and the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom for their support in creating the podcast. If you enjoyed the conversation, please like and subscribe wherever you're listening to the podcast. We look forward to bringing you more content. This podcast is created by Center for Communication Governance at National Law University Delhi. This episode was edited by Gopika.